Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was scheduled to deliver a speech last week to outline U.S. policy toward China, but the speech was suddenly postponed after he was tested positive for COVID. In these times of worsening relations between the U.S. and China, what will be the Biden administration's first formal strategy on China, and how will it affect the future direction of China-U.S. relations? And what can we expect from the administration's recent reinvigorated engagement with Asia? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm joined today by Professor Huang Jin, Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University, Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at American University, and Dr. Saeed Mahmood Ali, Associate Fellow at Institute of China Studies at University of Malaya. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. The U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said that the speech has been indefinitely postponed, but it is widely speculated that China policy Blinken was about to unveil was hostile and tough, but others would say it's basically summary of the U.S. practices on China. So Huang Jin, given the recent development over the past year, under the Biden administration, so what are you expecting from Blinken's speech?
I think that it will not be so-called dramatic or fundamentally new, comparing to the previous behavior or strategy of U.S. Towards China. But I think that Blinken may emphasize three new points. Number one is the importance of alliances. That is, United States will work with its allies and partners to outcompete China. A second, I think Blinken will emphasize the importance of values, or our shared value, that is the shared value of the United States and its allies vis-a-vis China, that is a democracy against non-democratic government. Number three, I think it emphasize that if we do not, we mean United States, do not outcompete China or hold China where it is, then what happened in today's Ukraine could happen to all of us. In order to do that, he may also want to emphasize the importance of boycotting China on high-tech and defense industry and so on and so forth. In short, I think that Blinken may try to emphasize the U.S. alliances and its importance in outcompeting China in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, the Biden administration has been in office for more than a year. Why does it take so long for the government to issue a formal China strategy?
The United States this administration came to power focusing on China. It said China was the pacing threat, and Russia, although it was also a threat to U.S. national security, was secondary. However, events have overtaken the administration's strategy. As my colleague said, the Biden administration has simply doubled down so far on the Trump policy. Many people thought that Biden was going to back off some of the strongly hostile rhetoric and policies toward China that Trump initiated, but he didn't. And when we look at who's in this administration, when we look at who his foreign policy experts are, it's not at all a surprise that he is so hawkish when it comes to China. He's got 16 members of the Center for New American Security who are his top advisors. He's got Kurt Campbell, who is the top advisor for the National Security Council. And what is Campbell's view? Campbell said last spring, he said that when it came to China, the period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end. And the dominant paradigm is going to be competition. Competition to these people does not mean the kind of win-win strategy that the Chinese have been talking about. It means defeating China. It means the U.S. reasserting itself as the hegemonic force in Asia and doing whatever it can militarily, economically, politically, and in terms of alliances to strengthen his position vis-a-vis China, which he sees as the real antagonist in the world today, although Russia has distracted everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hong Jim, the U.S. strategy obviously in Ukraine is like to weaken Russia. And then the Ukraine war, you can say, is a proxy war. And then the U.S. goal toward China is to defeat China. If that's the case, why should China simply say, oh, well, we'll stay neutral and we'll do nothing to help Russia? And then when U.S. defeats Russia, and then it will put all its attention on China. So that's kind of an ideal situation for Washington, but obviously very bad for China.
I think China sees several things in this Ukraine-Russia war. First, China realized that as a responsible power or big power in the world, China have to uphold some principles. That is, the sovereignty and international integrity cannot be violated. That was written in the UN Charter. I think it works for China's own interests to hold this principle. Second, China always follows this peaceful development strategy, and war is something China will oppose no matter what. So China is against war no matter who initiated war for whatever reason. So China tries to say, let's treasure this peace. And last but not least, we can see that China has 4 points in this policy towards this tragedy. Number one, like I said, is China try to hold moral high ground, which is important for China. That is the sovereignty and the national integrity, territorial integrity cannot be violated. Number two, China is against war for peace. And China's narrative, I think, to me, makes sense. That is, this tragedy is a result of Cold War mentality and the Cold War behavior. Cold War mentality means NATO. We know that Warsaw Pact dissolved after 1991, and NATO as a military alliance was established for Cold War. So it assumed that this NATO should also, stop to be existent. But NATO not only exists as a Cold War mentality, but continue to expand eastwards. That's why we have this tragedy. So China is against Cold War mentality and Cold War behavior. Number three is that China will try to support the European countries, especially Germany and France, to negotiate, to mediate a peace that is Normandy style or Normandy model. And China try, because China knows that the United States want to, this war continue, just like you said, to weaken Russia or even destroy Russia. And last but not the least, the fourth point is that China has maintained a very normal relationship with Ukraine and has provided humanitarian support to Ukraine. That shows that China is not really on Russia's side. China is on peace side. I think China's position so far, to me, holds water.
Mm-hmm. Very delicate position trying to strike a balance between, say, on this issue between Russia, Ukraine, between Russia and the West. So, Ali, I want to go back to you here. President Biden visited Lockheed Martin, touting the U.S. weapons, the role they played in the Ukraine war. A small issue related to this big picture here, the role of the military-industrial complex, because the U.S. is not only providing weapons to Ukraine, selling weapons to European countries, but also selling weapons to Taiwan. That's very, China sees that a very provocative, damaging the peace and stability here in the region. So the role of military-industrial complex, is there a role in the Ukraine war?
Well, I think the person we should listen to about this is President Eisenhower. When Eisenhower left office, in his valedictory address to the nation, he did warn the Americans about the growing capacity of the military-industrial complex, this organic element of the U.S. national security establishment, which is symbiotic. The military buys weapons and the industry provides the weapons, and often individuals travel from one sector to the other. So officials might serve in the Pentagon for some years and then move to the industry, and some industry executives might then be appointed to the Department of Defense by successive administration. So there is this symbiotic relationship. And we need to remember as well that General Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander in Europe that defeated Nazi Germany and the Axis. He also was an astute politician who won his re-election campaign, and he understood both the American political and military elements that governs that country, if you like, from the wings. It's not visible to the public, but it is structural and institutional. And he was able to discern that. And he warned that American democracy was threatened by this nexus of politics and military and industry operating symbiotically. And he warned his country against that. So I guess when you combine that with the post-Cold War American grand strategy of systemic primacy, that there was no longer a bipolarity at the core of the system, that the United States was the sole superpower, and then it adopted the grand strategic vision that its unipolarity must be sustained indefinitely into the future. And it identified 4 regions of great importance to this position. First, Europe; second, the Middle East; third, East Asia; and fourth, Latin America, where no peer competitor similar or comparable in power to the Soviet Union, which had disappeared then, would ever be allowed to rise again. And US military forces would be structured, armed, equipped, trained, and deployed on that basis. That strategy was the foundational principle of US Cold War, post-Cold War grand vision for itself and the world. And from there, everything that we see today has flowed. It has been reinforced by events, not weakened. So we can expect more of this. Yes, we can.
Yeah, more of this military-industrial complex. Peter, you talked about Kurt Campbell. He is seen as the Asian czar of U.S. Asian policy. He talked about these 2 theaters, theory, basically meaning that the U.S. is able or capable of concentrating, dealing with Asia, dealing with China on one hand, and then weakening Russia in the European continent. But the reason that he changed his tone, he said, talked up about this 1 theater theory. Why the change? What does it differ? Is there any difference?
I don't think there really is any difference. And there are many of the hawks in the United States. We talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, it goes beyond that because it's also the media. If you look at the television in the United States, we've got one retired general and retired admiral after another. These are the people who are on constantly, and they view the world through a military prism. And so when they look for solutions, their solutions tend to be military solutions. And that is quite alarming right now. And the same people who are such big proponents of defeating Russia now in Ukraine are also proponents of arming Taiwan in advance. They see that the mistake they made in Ukraine was not putting in more heavy armaments earlier. So many of them are saying now we've got to preempt this in Taiwan. We've got to act beforehand and bolster Taiwan's defenses like we're doing now with Ukraine. So it's a dangerous situation now because they're feeling as empowered. They've got new legitimacy. They feel that their strategy in Ukraine is succeeding right now, that Russia is being humiliated, weakened, defeated economically and militarily, and they're almost welcoming a confrontation over Taiwan as well. So this has created a more dangerous world, and the threat of use of nuclear weapons, which is finally being talked about, is real, is palpable in a way that hasn't been the case for 60 years now. So, which is why I would like to see the Chinese leaders act even more aggressively to try to do what they can do to help end this before it goes to a new stage that could be much, much more disastrous in terms of humanitarian terms in Ukraine, but also in terms of global expansion.
Well, Huang Jin, Blinken talked about asymmetrical defense capability in Taiwan, obviously by arming Taiwan with more weapons from the U.S. But tell us, what's at stake in terms of Taiwan for China, but also probably for this entire region. I mean, if there's a situation like a Ukrainian war, to happen in this region, every country that would be affected in a very bad way.
I think just like in the United States or in Taiwan, we cannot see them as a whole. There are differences. There are different interest groups, different opinions, different positions, and so forth. Just like Peter said, this war has empowered those hawkish people. They think that they can solve the so-called problems in a kind of military way. They believe that in a military conflict or confrontation, the United States is capable of prevailing, even with this kind of enormous danger of nuclear weapons. That's very dangerous. So therefore, I believe personally, no matter how much advanced weapons or arms United States provided to Taiwan, there's no way Taiwan can stand a kind of assault from mainland China. But the point is not this. The point is that to use Taiwan as a bait, to bait China into a kind of confrontation, they believe that China will go through what Russia is going through. That is, China will be humiliated, defeated, and once forever they're going to solve this so-called threat from China. This is indeed a wishful thinking, because both China and Russia, like the United States, are nuclear power. They are playing a very dangerous game. That's why I agree with Peter. We have to do something to stop this. But saying that, there's another problem, though, that created this problem. That is, U.S. politics is highly polarized. And to a large extent, the so-called rational head, the people with rational thinking, cannot really survive in the so-called new political correctness. That is, whatever you do, if you say anything in their view that in favor of China, in favor of peace, you'll be politically incorrect. You'll be overwhelmed. We have a lot of rational choice. We have a lot of cool head, but they're being overwhelmed in U.S. politics. It's very poisonous. You go to Washington, D.C., you have to be hawkish. Otherwise, you simply cannot survive politically. That's another way we see that, even though we say there's a deep division on national identity in the United States, which resulted in a highly polarization of politics, the result is that no matter who's in power, Trump or Biden, these political leaders, they cannot do anything else but be tough towards outside world, especially to Russians and Chinese like this, which of course they mark as an enemy in order to maintain a kind of solidarity or unity at home, to keep the political process keep going, functioning. That's very, very dangerous in my view. That is, the internal uncertainty of U.S. politics has enormous bad or negative impact on U.S. behavior towards outside world. And in return, of course, we see what's going on right now.
Well, Ali, focusing on this region, Antony Blinken's speech is expected to serve as a background for the upcoming events. For example, in this month, there will be the special U.S.-ASEAN summit in Washington, and then President Biden will pay a visit to Korea and Japan, probably Quad meetings later this month. So, what's the message for Asian countries here?
I think ASEAN countries were somewhat less enthusiastic about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, which was elaborated a few years ago, and subsequently activities of U.S. Navy and other military units operating in the region, than, say, for instance, Australia was, or Japan was. The Quad activity has picked up steam now under President Biden, and ASEAN has been somewhat skeptical. It has advanced its more, how shall I put it, economy-focused and peace-focused vision of the region. And that hasn't quite meshed with the U.S. view for the Indo-Pacific. And I think President Biden recognizes that the declaration, the sudden proclamation of the AUKUS agreement among the USA, Britain, and Australia took many in ASEAN countries by surprise. It was a disappointed surprise, not a pleasant surprise. After all, the USA and other great powers have always encouraged ASEAN to believe in ASEAN centrality in devising and shaping the security architecture of this region. And yet, AUKUS was proclaimed without any consultation whatsoever with ASEAN countries. So therefore, I think President Biden now feels it useful and necessary to engage with ASEAN and rebuild, if you like, trust and mutual confidence between Washington on the one hand, and ASEAN on the other. So that is one thing I would definitely expect to see, an encouragement of stronger relationship between ASEAN and Washington. But as regards Korea and Japan, they are regional allies and have been there for decades. And not so much Korea, but Japan is certainly very concerned about China and also concerned about what China might do about Taiwan. In fact, Japanese leaders have only in recent months stressed that what happens in Taiwan would have an impact on Japanese national security. So it's possible that Japan might take the lead, if you like, should the balloon go up, as it were, across the Taiwan Strait, rather than the US. The US are providing support to Japan, Japan taking a more sort of leading position in countering China across the Taiwan Strait. It could happen. South Korea slightly less or more restrained and less enthusiastic. Still, Japan, South Korea, and the USA together in this region would be quite a countervailing force against China, should China decide to operate against Taiwan.
Well, Huang Jin, obviously, China is the largest trading partner of almost all Asian countries, including East Asia, ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia. So how likely the U.S. will be succeeding the strategy in terms of continuing China, in terms of basically, drawing a line between, say, you will be, part of the U.S. alliance against China?
If past can provide us with any lessons or anything, I think that to contain China is a wishful thinking. It is wishful thinking. China's rise is inevitable, unless China itself made a mistake. The only country or the only people that can contain China is Chinese people and China themselves. And like I always said, this competition between the United States and China is a facade. Beneath this facade is the kind of both countries, for both sides, the most formidable challenge comes from within. For Biden, from United States, for Xi Jinping, from China. So therefore, it's kind of a race to see who gets its house in order first will gain initiative this competition. That's what worries me most, because as far as I can see, United States problems are deeply divided. This division is not political view. It's not just the economic view. It's a national identity. We have two groups of people who think they are the true Americans. The other side is fake. They also believe the other side, if they get into power, they're going to lead America into disaster. That's where the problem is. They cannot agree with anything. That's why they need a strong enemy outside to maintain this kind of facade of the United States of America, which is dangerous. As to other countries, just like Professor Ali just said, I think it's very difficult. When the push come to hush, I think they're going to make decisions. Even Japan, because for the Japanese, they know better than anybody else. There are two major concerns. Number one, Japan would not dare to make enemy at the same time with both Russians and the Chinese. They try to avoid this. That's why you see that Russia-Japan relationship, Japan always leave a little bit of room of maneuver, because for the Japanese, it's a nightmare if both two major powers in the region, Russia and China, be the enemy, and then they're going to meet the doomsday. And second, Japan's major concern is a normalization of the statehood. As that, the major obstacle come not from China, not from other Asian countries, but from United States of America. And this kind of dilemma that I say is this: the more dependent or reliant United States is on Japan in Asian Pacific or in the Pacific, the more Americans want to control Japan. But Japan, on the other hand, they say, the more you rely on me, the more power, the more equal footing I want. This kind of contradiction will be a structure. I think that would be a major problem. Japan is jumping so high, is so excited on Taiwan because, number one, Taiwan is where the U.S. and China's strategic interests really met at this time. This is really the key point. Second, Japan realized that if China prevails on the Taiwan issue, United States will have to withdraw from Western Pacific, which is not the good news for Japan at all. And last but not least, of course, if China really reunify with Taiwan, the U.S.-Japan alliance will be caught in middle. So Japan is very concerned about Taiwan's future, but that does not mean that Japan can handle China or confront China and so on. Japan will have to work with the United States of America. Now the problem between USA and Japan is who works for whose best interest. Is Americans working for the Japanese or Japanese working for the Americans? I think that the sense are very complicated.
Right. Peter, but if you look at the relationship between Beijing and Washington, it's not all bad. There's a talk of removing the tariffs on the imported Chinese goods to the U.S. So what's the likelihood?
Well, if it was up to Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, maybe there would be some progress made in reducing the tariffs. But there's bills now that have passed both houses of the legislature calling for the U.S. intensifying, increasing its competition with China, increasing the production of semiconductors, and increasing production of other technology. So we're talking about tens of billions of dollars invested purely for competition with China. And we're talking about what else is going on. Professor Wang Jing is talking about how divided the United States is. That's right, except the United States is not divided when it comes to foreign policy. The Democrats and Republicans are both hawks. The American people agree about China. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a national Gallup poll, 79% of the Americans have a negative view, an unfavorable view of China. 41% a very unfavorable view. So anything that the hawks want to do to build up the U.S. against China is going to be supported by both parties. And we see ominous developments in Asia, too. We look at what Abe's been saying recently, Shinzo Abe is saying in Japan, calling for Japan housing U.S. nuclear weapons, calling for the United States declaring openly that it will come to Taiwan's defense. And we see the new Yoon government in South Korea, again, very, very hawkish. So I think, although ASEAN might be divided, Myanmar supports Russia and Ukraine. Vietnam is very close to Russia. Indonesia is neutral. So they're somewhat divided on that. But overall, I think the direction is a very dangerous one right now. So I'm not optimistic. I'm quite worried. And that's why I'm calling on my Chinese friends to do everything they can to bring this Ukraine situation to an end as quickly as possible, because I think that's in everybody's interest.
On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.